Hello everyone, I'm going to discuss the topic injury by physical agent. So when we say injury by physical agent, divided siya into following categories: the mechanical trauma, the thermal injury, the electrical injury, and injury produced by ionizing radiation. So I'm going to tackle first the mechanical trauma. So what is mechanical trauma? So mechanical trauma is an injury to any portion of the body from a blow, crush, cut, or penetrating wound. And mechanical forces can inflict a variety of forms of damage and depende siya doon sa shape ng colliding object, sa amount of energy discharged at impact, at sa impact na nadudulot nito sa tissues at organs. At sa mechanical trauma, the patterns of injury can be divided into abrasions, contusions, lacerations, incised wounds, and puncture wounds. So first, I'm going to discuss the abrasion. So abrasion, or gasgas in Tagalog, so it is a wound produced by scraping or rubbing the skin surface, damaging the superficial layer. So dito sa abrasion, yung nadadamage lang is the superficial layer. And typically, skin abrasion remove only the epidermal layer. So next is the contusion. So for contusion, pasa siya sa Tagalog. So it is a wound usually produced by a blunt trauma. And dito, na-characterize siya by damage to vessels and extravasation of blood into tissue or leakage of blood into tissues. So next pattern of injury naman is laceration. So laceration is a tear or disruptive stretching ng tissue caused by the application of force by a blunt object. And in contrast with an incision or the incised wound is inflicted by a sharp instrument. So kumbaga sa laceration, intact yung bridging blood vessels niya kasi nga it is caused by a blunt object, while for incised wound naman, the bridging blood vessels are severed kasi nga it is inflicted by a sharp instrument. So another pattern of injury is puncture wound. So it is typically caused by a long narrow instrument and is termed penetrating when the instrument pierces the tissue, kagaya nung nasa image. And perforating naman when it traverses a tissue to also create an exit wound. So another example of puncture wound is gunshot wounds. And may mga special form yung mga puncture wounds na which can demonstrate distinctive features na importante sa mga forensic pathologists. For example, so if a gunshot wound ay mayroong powder burns na natira doon sa wound, then the bullet was fired at close range. And kapag wala namang powder burns yung wound, then the bullet was fired from more than 4 or 5 feet away. So last pattern of injury is vehicular accident, and it is one of the most common causes ng mechanical injury. So meron siyang 3 mechanisms: yung hitting a part of the interior of the vehicle or being hit by the objects that enter the passenger compartment during the crash, such as engine parts. The pangalawa, the being thrown from the vehicle, like palabas ng vehicle. And the pangatlo, being trapped in a burning vehicle. So yung pattern of injury dito, it relates to whether yung one or all 3 of these mechanisms ay operative. For example, sa head-on collision, yung common pattern of injury sustained by a driver na walang suot na seatbelts, it can include trauma to the head dahil sa windshield impact, sa chest dahil sa steering wheel impact, at saka sa knees dahil sa dashboard impact. So now that we are done with mechanical trauma, let's proceed to thermal injury. So thermal injury naman, it is an injury caused by excess heat and excess cold. So one example of thermal injury is thermal burns. So thermal burns are skin injuries caused by excessive heat, typically from contact with hot surfaces, hot liquids, steam, or flame. And yung severity ng burns na ito ay nakadepende siya sa important variables: yung depth, kung gaano ba kalalim yung burn, yung percentage of body surface involved, kung gaano ba kalawak, whether internal injuries from inhalation of hot and toxic fumes are present, kung yung internal injury ba ay from inhalation ng mga toxic fumes, and the promptness and efficacy of therapy, especially fluid and electrolyte management and prevention and control of wound infections. So mayroong dalawang type ng thermal burns: the full thickness burn and the partial thickness burn. So first, full thickness thickness burn. So full thickness burn, it produces total destruction of the epidermis and dermis, including the dermal appendages that harbor cells needed for epithelial regeneration. So sa full thickness burn, it include 3rd and 4th degree burns. So kumbaga total destruction nga ng epidermis and dermis. And for the morphology, they are white or charred, dry, and anesthetic. So next is the partial thickness burn. So compare dito sa full thickness burn, total destruction ng epidermis and dermis, dito naman yung deeper portions ng dermal appendages ay nasi-spared. So yung partial thickness burn, it includes the 1st degree burns o yung epithelial involvement only, at saka yung 2nd degree burns na which involve both epidermis and superficial dermis. So morphology ng partial thickness burn ay nakadepende sa depth. If it is pink or mottled is marked with spots, blistered, and painful. So despite continuous improvement sa therapy, any burn na nag-exceed sa 50% ng total body surface, whether superficial man siya or deep, ay potentially fatal. So here are some complications or conditions connected with thermal burns. First is the hypovolemic shock. So for hypovolemic shock, dito, kung yung burns ay more than 20% na ng body surface, nagkakaroon ng rapid shift of bloody fluids into the interstitial compartment. Kumbaga, yung fluid inside your blood vessels will quickly start to leak out. At yung leaked fluid na yon, magmumove siya doon sa spaces between your cells, which is called the interstitial spaces, and can cause swelling or edema. At yung fluid leakage na yon, hindi lang siya nangyayari doon sa kung saan yung site ng burn. It also happens throughout the body. So kung sobrang daming fluid yung nag-leak out from the blood vessels, syempre yung blood volume mag-drop siya. And that can lead to hypovolemic shock. So next is the pulmonary edema. So for pulmonary edema, yung blood vessels natin nagiging leaky siya kapag mayroong burns. So proteins like albumin that usually stay in the blood, nagli-leak out siya doon sa interstitial tissue. At syempre, we all know from the past lessons na proteins in the blood, especially yung albumin, it help maintain the oncotic pressure. So when protein is lost, kung yung albumin na yun is lost, there will be less pressure holding the fluid. So ibig sabihin, more fluid will leak out into the tissue, and that will result to widespread swelling throughout the body, and that include the pulmonary edema. So another important consideration is the degree of injury to the airways and lungs. So dito na papasok yung inhalation injury. So inhalation injury, frequently siya nangyayari in persons trapped in burning buildings. And there are 2 types of gases that a person can inhale in a burning building, the water-soluble gases and the lipid-soluble gases. So for water-soluble gases, for example, like chlorine, sulfur oxides, and ammonia, so when these gases, like it came into contact sa moisture sa airways natin, they chemically react. So for example, chlorine. So when we inhaled chlorine and it came contact with the moisture in our airways, it can form hydrochloric acid. So for sulfur oxides naman, it can form sulfuric acids. For ammonia, it can form alkaline solution. So these chemicals, they are highly irritating at corrosive sa tissues. So particularly in the upper airways, and that includes the nose, the mouth, the throat, and trachea. Since doon yung first point of contact, doon din mostly nangyayari yung irritation. And that will result to inflammation and swelling. Why? Kasi our body reacts to these irritants with inflammation as part of the immune response. And swelling sa ating airway, it can be dangerous kasi nga it narrows the passage for air. It can be partial obstruction or difficulty in breathing, and complete obstruction naman, ito na yung life-threatening. So another type naman is lipid-soluble gases. So lipid-soluble gases, sila yung gases that dissolves better in fats or lipids, like sa tissues sa ating katawan, including the lungs. An example of this is the nitrous oxide and products of burning plastics. So these gases, the lipid-soluble gases, can penetrate farther sa ating lungs, and it can reach the deeper airways like the bronchi and the alveoli where oxygen exchange occurs. At dito, nangyayari yung pneumonitis. Yun yung inflammation of the lungs dahil nga sa toxic effects ng lipid-soluble gases, which can lead to difficulty in breathing, coughing, and chest pain. Last is the organ system failure. So, yung burn site, ideal siya for growth of microorganism. And nangyayari yon direct bacteremia spread. So, bacteremia, it refers sa presence ng bacteria sa ating bloodstream. So, kasi normally, yung bacteria, dapat confined lang siya doon sa area of infection. But in bacteremia, yung bacteria, nag-spread siya doon sa bloodstream. And direct spread means yung infection sa local site ay directly nag-enter siya sa blood. So, of course, bacteria, they produces endotoxins. Yung endotoxins na yon, they are toxic substances na kikita sa outer membrane ng mga gram-negative bacteria. So, kung yung bacteria ay namatay or nag-multiply, nagre-release sila ng endotoxins sa bloodstream. At yung toxins na yon, it can travel throughout the body and can cause inflammation and can trigger harmful effects sa organs and systems. At syempre, pag na-release yung endotoxins at nag-spread yung bacteria sa ating bloodstream, it can lead to sepsis, organ failure, and other life-threatening complications. So now, let's proceed to another type of thermal injury, the hyperthermia. So, hyperthermia is the condition where the body's core temperature rises above normal due to excessive heat and the inability to cool down. So, ibig sabihin, sa hyperthermia, isa siyang condition na kung saan yung temperature natin ay tumataas above the normal. So, dito, prolonged exposure to elevated ambient temperature can result to heat cramps. Okay, so heat cramps. So, this happens when yung katawan natin, it loses important minerals like electrolytes. Kasi nga, we sweat a lot. So, nangyayari ito usually during hard exercise in hot weather. At common sign ng heat cramps ay yung muscle cramps, especially sa arms at saka sa legs. But in heat cramps, even though you're sweating a lot, yung body natin, it's still able to keep our internal temperature normal. So next is heat exhaustion. So heat exhaustion, it's the most common type ng heat-related illness. At it happens suddenly kasi it can cause a person to collapse or feel extremely weak. At yung main cause nito ay yung pagkawala ng body water, like loss of too much body water, which leads to low blood volume. And because of this, yung heart and blood vessels natin, it can't keep up, which causes our body to shut down temporarily. However, after like konting pahinga naman, the person will usually recovers quickly on their own. So next is heat stroke. So these conditions happens when the weather is very hot and humid. So dito nangyayari siya kasi yung natural way nung body natin, pag cool down, nag-stop siya mag-work. So, nag-stop din yung ating sweat. At yung internal body temperature naman natin, tumataas. So, what's happening inside the body is that yung blood vessel, it will widen too much, which can cause blood to pool in the skin and less blood to reach important organs. As a result, there's not enough blood na mag-circulate sa ating body, which can lead to serious problems. Next is the malignant hyperthermia. So, for malignant hyperthermia, compared the heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke, malignant hyperthermia naman is an inherited condition. So, this inherited condition is caused by changes sa genes like the RYR1. So, RYR1, it helps to control calcium levels in muscle cells. So, kung yung genes na to, it doesn't work properly, then the muscles can become overactive and produce too much heat. So, if this condition is not treated, it can be very dangerous at it can cause death in about 80% of cases. Pero kung na-recognize naman siya ng maaga and it is treated quickly with the right muscle relaxants, yung risk of dying naman, it will drop to less than 5%. So, now let's proceed to the last type of thermal injury, the hypothermia. So, hypothermia is a condition where the body's core temperature drops. So, kung sa hyperthermia, yung temperature ay tumataas from the normal value. Sa hypothermia naman is yung temperature naman ay nag-drop siya below 35 degree Celsius. So, prolonged exposure to low ambient temperature can lead to hypothermia. So, meron two mechanics yung hypothermia. The direct effects and the indirect effects. So, for direct effects, dito, as yung body natin, it gets very cold, yung low temperature can damage cells. Nangyayari ito because yung cell membranes natin, which are normally flexible, it can become rigid and brittle in the cold. So yung physical stress can cause the membranes to break or malfunction, which can lead to cell injury or death. So when body fluids naman, nag-freeze yung body fluids natin, ice crystals will form inside and outside of cells. And as yung water na yun ay mag-turn into ice, it will leave behind concentrated salts in the remaining liquid portion. At yung high salt concentrations na yan ay very toxic siya sa cells because they disrupt the balance of electrolytes and can damage cell structures. Moreover, yung ice crystals na napaform sa water or sa body fluids natin, it can also pierce and rupture cell membranes, which can cause further damage. Sa indirect effects naman, dito yung epekto ng hypothermia ay nakadepende siya sa rate at saka duration ng temperature drop. So for example, kapag yung body ina-expose sa cold for a long time, nangyayari yung vasoconstriction. Nangyayari siya to conserve heat. Moreover, yung blood vessels, mas nagiging permeable siya, which allows fluid to leak into the tissues and can cause edema. And over time as well, yung damaged tissue na yun, it can shrink and harden or scar, which can lead to long-term damage. However, if nagkaroon ng sudden drop ng temperature or like when yung karoon ng cold exposure suddenly and severely, of course, yung blood vessels magko-constrict siya ng mabilis at saka yung blood mas magiging thicker dahil nga sa cold. And this reduces blood flow which can lead to ischemic injury. At saka yung nerves affected area, it can also become damaged dahil nga sa lack of blood at saka sa cold stress. So now that we are done with thermal injury, let's proceed to electrical injury. So electrical injury, of course, it is fatal and can arise from low voltage currents or from high voltage currents carried in power lines or by lightning. So meron siyang two types, the burns and ventricular fibrillation. So for burns, nangyayari siya when yung electricity ay nag-flow siya sa body natin for too long. At saka yung electric current, it creates heat. So, it causes burns on the skin kung saan yung electricity nag-enter and exit sa body. It can also damage the internal organs along the path the electricity takes inside the body. For ventricular fibrillation naman, voltage, yun yung nagpupush sa electricity through wires and devices. So, normally, yung katawan natin, it doesn't allow electricity to pass through them. Kasi nga, yung skin natin mayroong resistance. However, if yung skin natin ay basa, it lowers the resistance. That's why electricity can flow through your body much more easily. And kapag nagpass na sa body yung electricity, it can interfere sa heart's normal electrical signal. And yun nga, ang one dangerous result nito ay yung ventricular fibrillation. For ventricular fibrillation, this can stop the heart from working and can be life-threatening. So, in short, wet skin, kapag basa yung balat natin, it lowers the resistance of our body sa electricity, which allows higher amount of electricity to flow through our body and can cause serious harm, especially sa ating heart. So that's all for electrical injury. Let's proceed to injury produced by ionizing radiation. So medyo mahaba to dito. So for radiation is energy that travels in the forms of waves or high-speed particles at meron siyang wide range of energies that span the electromagnetic spectrum. Radiation is divided into non-ionizing and ionizing radiation. So, for non-ionizing radiation, it includes things like the UV light, the infrared light, the microwaves, and sound waves. So, non-ionizing energy or this type of energy, it can make atoms move or vibrate. Pero it's not strong enough to knock electrons out of atoms. While non-ionizing radiation can affect our body, like it can cause sunburn, it doesn't have enough power to cause the same kind of deep damage that stronger radiation can, like X-ray. While for ionizing radiation naman, it is a type of energy that is strong enough to knock tightly held electrons out of atoms. So, kumbaga, mas strong siya. And when this happens, yung freed electrons na yon, it will hit other atoms and knock out more electrons, which creates a chain reaction. And this process is called ionization. So, ionizing radiation can cause damage to cells in the body. That's why, compared sa non-ionizing, ionizing radiation is a type of radiation that can be harmful. So, the main sources of ionizing radiation ay first, X-ray and gamma rays, and second, the high-energy neutrons. So, for X-ray and gamma rays, they are electromagnetic waves of very high frequency. While for high-energy neutrons naman, merong alpha particles and beta particles. So, for alpha particles, it is composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. While for beta particles, which are essentially electrons. So, radiation in this form is used in the treatment of cancer, in diagnostic imaging, and as therapeutic or diagnostic radioisotopes. However, it is also mutagenic, carcinogenic, and teratogenic. So even though ionizing radiation is helpful in medical practice, but these applications constitutes a two-edged sword. So here are the following terms used to express exposure, absorption, and dose of ionizing radiation. So we have Curie, Gray, and Sievert. If we compare all the three, so yung Curie, it measures radioactivity or yung source strength, and it focuses on how much radiation is emitted. At ginagamit siya sa physics, nuclear reactors, radioactive materials. While yung Gray naman, it measures absorbed dose. So nakafocus siya sa how much radiation energy is absorbed by tissue. At ginagamit siya for radiotherapy, for radiation safety. While yung Sievert naman, it measures equivalent dose at nakafocus siya sa biological effect of absorbed radiation. At ginagamit siya for medical imaging, radiation protection, and public health. Aside sa physical properties ng radiation, yung biologic effects ng radiation, nakadepende din siya on these variables: the rate of delivery, the field size, cell proliferation, hypoxia, the vascular damage. So for rate of delivery, although the effect of radiant energy is cumulative, delivery in divided doses may allow cells to repair some of the damage in the interval. So, ibig sabihin, mas effective daw kung fractional doses yung ginagamit. Like, kasi it has cumulative effect only to the extent that repair during the intervals is incomplete. So, kasi we all know radiant energy like X-rays or gamma rays used in radiation therapy, it can damage cells. Pero yung biologic effect, nakadepende siya how much radiation is used o yung rate of delivery niya or how fast it is delivered. So, if radiation is delivered all at once, it can cause a lot of damage sa cells. However, if it is given like in smaller or like separate doses over time, or yun nga, fractional doses, especially sa normal or healthy cells, so, normal and healthy cells, they can use the time in between doses para ma-repair yung damage. So, fractional doses reduces harm to normal cells and makes treatment more controlled. So, sa radiotherapy of tumors naman, it exploits the capability ng normal cells to repair themselves, di ba? And to recover more rapidly than tumor cells. At tumor cells or cancer cells, they are sensitive to radiation. So, less capable sila sa pag-repair ng damage compared sa normal cells. So, in radiotherapy, doctors give radiation in fractions or in small doses nga, so that the normal cells can get time to repair between those doses. So, next is the field size. Sa field size, the amount of the body exposed to radiation or yung field size, it can make big differences in how harmful the radiation is. So, if only a small part ng body natin is exposed sa high dose ng radiation, at saka yung rest of the body natin is protected naman, then our body can usually handle radiation better. That's because yung damage is limited lang doon sa small area. At yung healthy parts ng body naman can help with healing and recovery. However, if a larger area ng body natin is exposed kahit sa lower dose lang ng radiation, it can be much dangerous kasi more tissues and organs are affected. So, our body can't recover as easily. So next is cell proliferation. So for cell proliferation, ionizing radiation damages DNA. So rapidly dividing cells are more vulnerable to injury than are quiescent cells. So when we say rapidly dividing cells, sila yung cells na they frequently make copies of themselves. So they are more likely to be harmed dahil nga they are actively using their DNA to divide. Unlike sa quiescent cells, yung quiescent cells like our brain or muscle cells which don't divide often, they are less vulnerable kasi nga they aren't trying to copy or like they aren't using their DNA for division at the time nung exposure. While in non-dividing cells like neurons and muscles, the cell might survive DNA damage unless the radiation dose is extremely high. Why? Kasi these cells, they aren't actively dividing. So, hindi sila nag-replicate, hindi nila nire-replicate yung DNA. So, some damage won't immediately affect their survivals. However, in dividing cells, they check their DNA for errors during each stage of division using cell cycle checkpoints. So, kung yung DNA na damage from radiation, yung cell natin will either stop dividing or magkakaroon ng growth arrest or magsi-self-destruction or apoptosis para ma-prevent yung pag-pass on ng damaged DNA. So, therefore, tissues that constantly make new cells like the gonads, the bone marrow, the lymphoid tissue sa immune system, the GI tract lining sa digestive system, they are very sensitive to radiation. So, next is hypoxia. So, dito, yung ionizing radiation like X-ray or gamma rays, it will hit water molecules sa ating cells. And when the water ay nag-break apart in a process called radiolysis, it will create reactive oxygen species o yung ROS. At yung ROS na to, they are very reactive and can damage DNA. So, yung damage na nakakos ng ROS, yun yung one main reasons why radiation therapy works kasi it leads to mutation, broken DNA, and ultimately cell death. And for hypoxia, it means low oxygen level. So, kasi some tumors, they grow very quickly, faster than new blood vessels can form to supply oxygen, especially doon sa center ng tumor. At yung tumor na yun, yung center ng tumor na yun, these areas become poorly oxygenated or hypoxic. So, why is this a problem? Bakit problem na yung center ng tumor ay hypoxic? Kasi yung creation ng reactive oxygen species, nakadepende siya doon sa presence ng oxygen. So, kapag sa low oxygen conditions, of course, kukunting ROS lang din yung maproproduce. So, less DNA damage will happen. And that means radiation is less effective doon sa oxygen-poor areas of the tumor. So, next is vascular damage. So, endothelial cells line the inside of our blood vessels. So, they are moderately sensitive to radiation, meaning na they can be harmed even if they aren't the most sensitive cells. So, when yung endothelial cells natin ay na-damage by radiation, yung blood vessels natin can become narrowed or completely blocked. And this disrupts normal blood flow. So, kung less yung blood flow, less yung oxygen and yung nutrients na pupunta sa tissues. And this can cause impaired healing, fibrosis, or chronic ischemic atrophy. However, these changes may appear months or years after exposure. So, yung radiation effects sa blood vessels ay delayed siya. Damage might not show up right away or it could take months or even years to become noticeable. Moreover, yung neurons or yung brain cells natin, they are not easily damaged by radiation directly. Kasi nga, hindi sila nagde-divide often. But, kung yung radiation, if radiation damages blood vessels sa ating brain, it can cause indirect injury sa brain tissue over time. It can be like na yung brain natin, it can suffer from poor circulation, which can lead to neurological problems later on. So next is DNA damage and carcinogenesis. So, the most important cellular target ng ionizing radiation ay yung DNA natin. So, damage to DNA na which caused by ionizing radiation that is not precisely repaired can lead to mutation, which can manifest years or decades later as cancer. So, ionizing radiation damages DNA in multiple ways. It can, pwede niyang ma-alter yung DNA bases, like yung building blocks ng genetic code. It can cause single-strand breaks, like it can damage one side of the DNA ladder. Or more seriously, double-strand breaks or yung both sides ng DNA ay will be broken. And also, it can create crosslinks na kung saan yung DNA, it will get abnormally stuck sa protein, which can disrupt normal functions. So as you can see here from this image, merong two effects sa ionizing radiation, yung indirect at direct effects. So for the direct effects, yung ionizing radiation, it directly hits and breaks the DNA strand, which will result in immediate damage to the DNA itself. While for indirect effect naman, the radiation can cause ionization of water molecules or other cellular molecules, which create free radicals. Yeah, as you can see here, like ionization, then free radical formation. At yung free radicals na yon, they are highly reactive and can damage DNA indirectly. So, this effect, na-enhance siya under high oxygen tension. So, kumbaga, more oxygen, more damage from free radicals. For DNA damage naman, of course, both indirect and direct effect can lead to DNA damage. And it can go down to two general paths: the failed or aberrant repair, and the successful DNA repair and tissue constitution. So for failed or aberrant repair, so kung yung cells natin, it fails to repair the DNA, it can result to inhibition of cell death. So it can lead to cell death. So the cell can't replicate, so it dies. Next is damage to fetus or germ cells, which can lead to teratogenesis. So magkakaroon ng birth defects or developmental abnormalities. And lastly, the incorrect repair plus the additional mutation, which can result in carcinogenesis, or it can transform into a cancer cell. While if naging successful yung DNA repair and tissue reconstitution, our body's natural repair mechanisms will correct the damage. So, normal function may be restored if no mutation persists. So, next is fibrosis. Fibrosis. So, what is fibrosis? So, fibrosis is when normal functional tissue like yung lung, skin, or muscle ay na-replaced by stiff scar tissue. And this scar tissue doesn't work like the original. It can impair organ function. So, why does fibrosis, bakit nga ba siya nangyayari after radiotherapy? Kasi radiation damages the blood vessels. So, pag na-damage yung blood vessels, it will cut off oxygen and nutrients, which will lead to ischemia. So, it also kill stem cells or the reserve cells that helps regenerate normal tissue. Radiation also triggers the immune system to release signals like cytokines and chemokines. And these signals activate fibroblasts, which are cells that produce collagen, the main ingredient in scar tissue. That's why fibrosis happens after radiotherapy. So, when does it happen? Like, nangyayari ba agad yung fibrosis? No, it's not immediate. Kasi, fibrosis usually develops weeks to months after radiation therapy. So, what are the consequences of fibrosis after radiotherapy? Of course, it can cause scarring and tissue stiffness. At in some cases, it will lead to adhesions where yung tissues, they stick together abnormally. Or yung affected area, it may lose function depending on the organs. Like, example, first lungs, intestine, and skin. So now, let's proceed to morphology. So, mayroong changes in chromosomes, cytoplasmic changes, nuclear swelling, and apoptosis. So, for changes in chromosomes, yung radiant energy, it can damage or it can show a wide range ng structural changes sa chromosomes including deletions, breaks, translocation, and fragmentation. And of course, yung mitotic spindle, it will become disorderly in which polyploidy and aneuploidy can be encountered. For cytoplasmic changes naman, of course, radiant energy can also affect the cytoplasm or the rest of the cell outside the nucleus. And these effects includes cytoplasmic swelling, o na kung saan yung cells puno siya ng fluid which is a sign of early injury. The mitochondrial distortion, na kung saan the mitochondria is damaged and which can impair energy production. And lastly, the degeneration of the ER. So we all know that ER helps in protein and lipid production. So if it is damaged, of course, it disrupts those processes. And plasma membrane breaks and focal defects may appear. So yung plasma membrane, it is the cell's outer layer. So the effect of radiation sa plasma membrane, of course, it can cause the plasma membrane to develop tears or weak spot. Those tears and weak spot compromise the cell's ability to control what goes in and out. So next is nuclear swelling. So for nuclear swelling, yung damage, one damage that radiation can bring to the nucleus is swelling. Kasi nga, radiation can cause molecular disruption. So yung disruption na yun, it can trigger series of stress responses which makes the nucleus expand. Kasi nga, yung cell, it tries to deal with the damage. And in some cases, the cell may become overwhelmed and lose its ability to function properly. So last is apoptosis. So we all know na yung apoptosis is siyang programmed cell death mechanism. That happens when yung cell it experience irreversible damage. And radiation can cause so much damage sa cell's DNA or cellular structure that yung cell is forced to commit apoptosis para ma-prevent yung damage from spreading. So this protective mechanism, by eliminating the severely damaged cells, napaprevent niya yung the potential for malignant transformation or the development of cancers. And at extremely high dose levels of radiant energy, features that foretell impending cell death such as nuclear pyconesis appear quickly. So, pyconesis, yun yung shrinkage or condensation ng nucleus, which is a sign of cell death. So, kung yung cells ay na-expose sa high level of radiation, they can experience severe DNA damage, and that will lead to the formation ng pycnotic nuclei. So, yung pycnosis na yun, it is a rapid process, meaning na at extremely high radiation doses, cells will show clear signs of impending death very quickly. At high dose radiation, it can cause acute damage to cells, which can trigger immediate signs ng nuclear destruction, and can also lead sa breakdown and death ng cell through process like apoptosis. So, here, yung figure 7 to 16, pinapakita dito yung main consequences ng radiation injury. And as already mentioned, na yung most sensitive organs at saka tissue ay yung gonads, the hematopoietic and lymphoid system, and the lining of the GI tract. While table 7 to 7, it shows the estimated threshold doses for acute radiation effect on specific organ. For example, for testes, the health effect of radiation is the temporary sterility. And for that to happen, it needs 0 to 15 sievert dose of 0 to 15 sievert. So the changes in the hematopoietic and lymphoid systems, along with the cancer induced by environmental or occupational exposure to ionizing radiation, are summarized as follows. So here is the effects on organ systems. First, the hematopoietic and lymphoid system. So lymphocytes are easily destroyed. So because they are extremely sensitive sa radiation, at like mabilis silang ma-destroyed whether they are in the bloodstream, or like they are stored in places like lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, or gut. And that makes our body weaker at defending itself against infections after radiation exposure. Granulocytes are another type ng white blood cells that help fight bacteria. So at first, yung number of granulocytes sa blood may go up because the body is responding sa stress or sa early inflammation. But by the end of the first week, yung numbers na yon, they will drop sharply because radiation damages the cells that produce them. So this drop increases the risk of infections. Platelets drops more slowly. So, platelets are the cells that help your blood clots. And radiation also damages the bone marrow cells that make platelets. However, yung effect na to, that effect happens a bit later than with white blood cells, and yung recovery is also slower. So, with fewer platelets, so the person is at higher risk of bruising or bleeding. While mature red blood cells are pretty resistant sa radiation, yung young cells that create them in the bone marrow are not. So, radiation damages these precursor cells, so yung body, they can't make enough new RBCs. As a result, anemia happens and develops after 2 to 3 weeks and can last for a long time and even months. So, this can cause fatigue, weakness, and shortness of breath. So, in short, radiation severely weakens the body's ability to make and maintain blood cells, which can lead to weakened immune system, increased bleeding, and long-lasting fatigue from anemia.
So now let's proceed to environmental exposure and cancer development. So environmental exposure, so this refers to like how certain environmental factors like ionizing radiation, how can it contribute to the formation of cancer or neoplasms in the body. So any cell capable of division that has sustained mutation has the potential of become cancerous. Kasi cells that can divide like yung skin cells, intestinal lining cells, blood-forming cells, sila yung mas mataas yung risk. Sila yung may mataas na risk. So, if these cells are damaged, especially at the DNA level, na-damage sila ng radiation, and they don't die, or hindi agad na-repair yung damage, they might start to divide uncontrollably, which is the hallmark ng cancer. And mutation caused by radiation also can disrupt the genes that regulate the cell cycle, like tumor suppressor genes or proto-oncogenes, which push cells towards a cancerous state. Thus, nagkakaroon ng increased incidence of neoplasms in any organ after exposure to ionizing radiation.
So, historical examples includes yung increased cancer rates sa mga atomic bomb survivors, radiation workers, at sa patients receiving radiation therapy. So, next is occupational exposure and cancer development. So, dito, in-explain yung connection between occupational exposure sa radon at saka yung pag-develop ng cancer, particularly lung cancer. So, ito yun. So, radon is ubiquitous product of the spontaneous decay of uranium. So, radon, naturally occurring siya, and isa siyang radioactive gas that forms sa uranium when yung uranium in rocks, soil, and water breaks down. So, it is almost present everywhere, though in small amounts. So, radon itself, hindi siya highly dangerous, pero when it decays, it produces radon daughters, specifically yung polonium-214 and polonium-218, which are highly radioactive and can emit alpha particles. So, yung alpha particles, it is a type of radiation na it can be very damaging sa tissue, especially when they come into contact with it, especially sa lungs, kasi nai-inhaled. So, these radon decay products ay mayroong short half-lives, meaning they decay quickly. Mabilis yung pag-decay nila, and can also emit a lot of radiation in a short period. which also increases the potential for damage. So, kung yung radon daughters na polonium-214 and polonium-218 ay na-inhaled, they will be trapped in the lungs. And over time, yung radiation na nai-emit nila can damage lung cells and can also increase the risk of developing lung cancers. So, yung mga uranium miners who are frequently exposed sa high levels of radon, sila yung may significant na sila yung they are at significantly higher risk for developing lung carcinomas or cancer of the lungs. So next is total body irradiation. So for total body irradiation, so this explains the concept ng total body irradiation at saka yung effects niya sa body when our body is exposed to various doses of radiation. So, TBI or the total body irradiation, it refers sa exposure ng ating body sa radiation. So, rather than localized areas such as single organ. So, as a whole yung total body radiation. So, even when small doses ng radiation, if it is distributed over large areas ng body, ng ating katawan, it can still have serious consequences for health. So, 1 sievert, yun yung unit na ginagamit, sabi ko nga kanina, to measure the biological effect ng radiation sa tissues. So, if a person is exposed sa dose ng to a dose of radiation like below 1 sievert, yung effects, of course, is minimal or absent. This means that at lower doses, the body can often repair the damage or handle the exposure without significant harm. However, when the radiation dose increases beyond 1 sievert, dito na it can lead to acute radiation syndromes or the ARS. ARS is a group of symptoms resulting from high doses of radiation. So, in short, kapag low radiation doses, it can cause minimal or no symptoms. However, if high radiation dose, it can lead to acute radiation syndrome, which has an effect on hematopoietic system, the gastrointestinal system, and the central nervous system. So, yung severity ng symptoms, it increases with the dose of radiation and the extent of exposure to the body. And that's all